Why I decided to animate Mr. Bear's Christmas. I think I've always loved that kind of animation. Ever since I was younger, like I really loved the Wind in the Willows by Cosgrove Hall. So much so that I went to see the sets for my 9th birthday, which was really inspiring, seeing them all laid out. And then Wallace and Gromit came along, which I really loved as well. And I used to make like little plasticine figurines, which was really, really fun. But back then I didn't have like the digital cameras or the apps to play about with the filmmaking. But I used to really enjoy just making the plasticine models. So I think it's always been in me to play about with the animation. And especially last Christmas, watching like the Snail and the Whale and the Gruffalo and things like that with my nephew, it was sort of ticking away in the back of my mind that one day I'd really love to have my stories made into an animation like that. So I just decided that I'd try and make it happen myself. I had actually been trying to make a model of the carousel for Mr. Bear's Day Out, and I was wondering how small I could make the figures. So I actually commissioned a lady that I found on Etsy to, she could make Needlefelt out of dog photos. So I thought, right, well, if I send her one of my illustrations, perhaps she could Needlefelt Mr. Bear and Mouse. So I was keen to see how small she could actually make them. And she did a wonderful job. But they were relatively big, and I sort of put to bed the idea of making the carousel because it would have needed to be huge. So that once I'd seen Mr. Bear and Mouse actually there, I just couldn't like get it out of my head that I wanted to do something with that. So I started making small animations just with a free stop motion app that I downloaded. And it was just amazing to see them come to life. And I thought, well, if I can do these, I can probably animate Mr. Bear's Christmas because it's not that big of a story. And naively, in my mind, I thought, well, this is not going to be that big of a project. But I was quite wrong with that. But once it had planted the seed, I just thought, yeah, I really would love to do that. And the next hurdle was going to be, right, I've got Mr. Bear, I've got Mouse, but to get Mr. Bear's Christmas done, I need all of the characters, which would be quite expensive to get them all done with the wire armature that I needed to make them stay in place to animate. So I thought that was a big hurdle. But then chatting with a friend who actually works with wool, she was convinced that I could Needlefelt. I wasn't so convinced myself, but she was so confident that I could do it that she actually sent me a starter kit in the post, which was unbelievably kind. So I read the book about how to have a go, and I just started poking some wool, and actually it was achievable. Doing the Needlefelt actually really felt like sketching, but instead of using a pencil, it was like sketching with wool. So I made a squirrel to start off with, and it actually worked out pretty well. So I thought, right, well, this actually could be done. And again, having that seed in my mind, I thought, right, I really do actually want to do this. So I set about needle-felting the rest of the characters and ordered the wool that I needed to have a go. So that took about a month to bring them all to life, which was actually really fun. So once I got all of the characters, the next thing I needed to think about was how to actually make a set, and that was where the project really leapt and grew arms and legs, so to speak. I realised that the scale that I had, so Mr. Bear was like yay big, his house needed to be sort of yay big, the forest needed to be bigger still. So that took a bit of researching and a bit of thought, and also meant that I took up a room in my parents' house, which was unbelievably kind of them to let me do that. And they were really patient with that. So I actually borrowed some pallets from the local village and then created a sort of frame, ordered some walls which I printed, so I used the same backdrop that I use in the illustrations and printed some like snowy trees in the colours that I would use. And then my idea was that since you use like this foam sponge to Needlefelt on, and I thought, right, well, I can probably pin stuff to that. That might make quite a good base, and then when they're moving around, I can just pin stuff in. So I ordered a big chunk of foam as well. So that was the base, and then I'd used like some plain white wool wadding as well, which had worked really well for making the characters. And I thought, well, that's perfect for snow. I can use that for the walls. So I just ended up making everything out of wool and just needle felting this whole set. So the walls, the floor, the snow. The things I got stuck with were the trees were really, really tricky, especially out of season. So trying to find a way of making snowy trees. I had a shot at making them myself, and they just looked a bit odd. So I went online and actually found some trees that fitted perfectly, and I managed to kind of plant them into the set. So I sort of had to cut holes and plant the trees in. But actually that worked out really well. But that meant several days trawling garden centres in August and just trying to find a way to get some trees on set, which felt like it was never going to happen at the time. But the ones that worked out just fitted perfectly. So it was definitely worth sticking with it. I suddenly realised it was going to be quite tricky trying to go between like the indoor set and the outdoor set. So instead of just having one and having the pressure to kind of get all that perfectly and then tear it down, I managed to set up two, so it took up quite a bit of room, but that really helped taking the pressure off having it all perfectly, and that meant that I could shoot any of the indoor scenes and then move on to the outdoor scenes and go between the two. And then I had a real stroke of luck as well. I had a message from somebody that lives locally who knew, well, he lived next door to an animator, so he put us in touch and we had a coffee, and it was amazing to meet him and just pick his brains, and he'd worked on loads of things that I'd watched, so it was really interesting hearing him talk about his job. And he specialised in lighting, so I asked him loads of questions about that, and I basically grabbed loads of lamps from around the house and it looked okay, but the shadows were falling in funny places, and I picked his brains about how to fix that, and he really kindly offered to come and light it for me and brought his lights from his house, and that was just amazing. That was such a stroke of luck, which I'm really, really thankful for, and it really lifted and made everything look a lot smarter and more, it got the warmth of Mr. Bear's house, and the way he lit the forest was amazing as well. So that was such a stroke of luck. And every time I changed the scene, he came back and relit it for me and then left me to film it, and that was super helpful. Yeah, the only downside of having used the foam, it worked really well for pinning everything to it, but it did mean that things were wobbly, and I had been advised to be careful with stuff being really well pinned down and tripods being pinned down. After a few days shooting, I could see why. And as I played stuff back, just where I'd moved stuff and the ground kind of wobbled, Mr. Bear's table wobbled, there was quite a lot of movement. And I think I quite like to get stuff done as well as I can do. I had to sort of step back a little bit and just accept that this was new to me, and it was a learning curve, and just be okay with some hiccups in there, and hope that it adds to a bit of charm of it. But I think if I did it again, I would definitely find a way to make it more secure so that movement wasn't happening when I moved Mr. Bear or Mouse or whoever on set. But I definitely learned as I went along, and it was a fun learning curve, but definitely a lot to think through. The hardest thing for me, I think, was sort of working with self-doubt on my shoulder all the time, and those days where it feels massive what you're trying to do and not having a clue what you're doing. It was like you're kind of wrangling with yourself. You know that you need to crack on and just have a go, but you're sort of blinded by the overwhelm of what you're trying to do. So I think that was quite tough. Just some days I'd just make myself go in the room and just do it. And it would take, a few hours to get set up. But once I got going, once I got into it, it all just came together, and it became a lot more fun once I started. But I think there were definitely points, like with creating the set or with learning new technology, if I made a mistake, like if sometimes the the tripod would move or something, and then I couldn't reset it to where it was and had to start again. Just little hiccups that just made it feel a bit more tricky, but you soon forget that once you've had you can play it back and you look at what you've actually done and it's coming together, and that really helps just keep moving forwards and looking at the little steps rather than looking at the big picture. So yeah, it was a lot of sort of tricky days, but then like really rewarding days when it was coming together, and it was a lot of fun just actually having a play. Like I had the story there, but I felt like it was quite fun just picking different scenes and elaborating them and thinking like, how can I show this? It was really fun. The one thing that was really nice was when I'm drawing it can be quite tricky. I know what I'm trying to show in a scene, but it is sometimes quite tricky to get the right emotion or get it to look exactly how you want it to look. And when I actually had the characters right there, I could really feel how Mr. Bear would be looking at Mouse or vice versa, or it was really fun to actually use them to show the emotion that I wanted to show without actually needing to draw it. It was just like right there and just put them in a position. And you could gauge that just by looking at the playback and think, yeah, that I can feel that, rather than sometimes you'd catch an expression that didn't quite match what you were trying to do. But that was a lot of fun actually, having it for real rather than it being a 2D drawing. So yeah, the first Mr. Bear prototype that I had was really, really light, so I couldn't, like if I lifted his arm it would just go blop. So I had to put some wire in there to hold it all together, but I thought I'd have a go at weighting it as well, so I got some baking beans and filled Mr. Bear with sort of ceramic weighted beans, which I thought would help that he would probably stand up more, but it actually didn't really work, and he loves to fall over all the time. So that meant quite a few pins going through his feet, and actually I'd also had some batteries for some of the lighting, and I used to just pop a Duracell battery just behind him as much as I could get him out of scene as possible, and that helped him stand up. But there was a lot of time spent sort of doubled over just holding him in a certain position, just praying that he'd stand up as I let go. Sometimes he'd just face plant and I'd have to start again. But, yeah, it was very top heavy actually, and just would fall really easily. Whereas Mouse was a lot easier, like just very cooperative, and I could pin Mouse really easily. And that was a lot easier to work with, I think, because it's quite small and quite light. So that was a lot easier. But yeah, there were definitely some scenes, mostly when Mr. Bear would be walking, that were really challenging to get him to stay standing. And putting up the Christmas tree was one of the trickier ones to film, as was moving through the forest. Mr. Badger was very similar as well, also liked to fall over a lot. So yeah, some of the ones where there were multiple animals at once, that would just take, I think I spent about 3 hours on about 8 seconds of film, just holding them, praying that they'd stay, and then taking the picture and then going back again, and that definitely took a lot of patience. But yeah, it was worth it, and there was some scenes where you can see some of the props that held them up, but I just thought, right, I'll just edit those out afterwards. Yeah, so I knew that I'd love to have some music behind the animation, and so I started investigating, finding someone that might want to help me with that. And again, much like the lighting, I had a really lucky connection as I was chatting to somebody who knew someone who composes and lectures in composition, who was really interested in helping me out. So it was just such a chance connection, and I'm so grateful for that. So that's been really cool, just getting it. I've only had snippets of music so far, but it's just amazing dropping it into the film and hearing it come alive. So I feel so lucky that that's happened as well. I'm really looking forward to hearing how that turns out. Yeah, so I needle-felted some tiny lanterns for the animals coming through the forest. That was a bit of a challenge as well. Initially I had some tiny LED bulbs, but they were coming out quite green when I shot the picture. And I wanted them to have like a warm yellow glow to them. So I tried wrapping them in tissue paper and painting them yellow, which worked a little bit, but it still looked like a funny colour, especially in contrast to the other lights. So I managed, with the help of my dad, to solder some little mini light bulbs and wire them in. And then I managed to wire them into the characters and kind of needle felt them into their arms. So that was quite complicated, as was I then had to kind of wire down into the snow and then underneath and connect it to the transformer. So every time I moved them, it kind of tugged at the set quite a bit, and that was really fiddly and quite dodgy wiring by me. But I don't think I'll make an electrician, but I managed to hook it all up, and it did work out. But yeah, that was really fiddly. But the tiny light bulbs looked absolutely perfect. So yeah, that was another bridge to cross, but yeah, that worked out really well. Same thing with making the post box. I thought I could have a go with using some Fimo, especially because I used Fimo when I was younger. So I made that. It looked really cool, and then spray painted it with some acrylic spray paint, and it just didn't dry. And then about a week later I googled, can you spray paint Fimo, which I should have done right at the start, and it was said absolutely no. So that was back to square one on that. But I managed to cobble together like a candle with some styrofoam that I kind of sandpapered into shape, and that was, I then papier-mâché'd that. It was just like a proper craft scene back home. And then I managed to spray paint on top of the papier-mâché, and that held and it dried. So that worked out, which didn't look as good as the first one, but it was more than okay. So that was quite a challenge to make as well. So I think like the biggest hurdle was definitely getting the set pulled together and trying to get that all right. But once it was all in place, it felt really cool to actually start shooting with it. It was fun. So one of the tips that the lighting guy gave to me, Dan, he said it would be good to black out the room that I'm working in, and I'm thinking, right, I'm using a room at my parents' house, which they've been very generous and understanding about already. So then I had to go and ask for permission to black out the windows as well, which again they were very understanding about. But it was quite a pain to do. So I went for bin bags and double-sided sticky tape, and that held for a bit, but I was doing it in the summer, and every time the windows heated up, it all just peeled off. So I'd sort of be going into this room ready to start, and I'd just sort of sigh every time I walked in and all the stuff had dropped off the windows. I had to start again and put it all back up, which sort of just got really frustrating. But it really did help, actually, having that constant light, and it was worth doing it. But it was quite a faff. Yeah, so having the room that I was working in, especially I had two pallets side by side with pallet frames as well, and that pretty much took up all the floor space. And then there were the wires and the tripods, my laptop, and after all that was in there, I had this tiny little space. And it was quite hot as well in the room with all the lights and the fact that I was shooting in the summer. So most of the time I just worked in something comfy like my pajamas or whatever, and then I could just kind of squeeze around in this tiny space. But it worked out fine. It was quite uncomfortable physically, because a lot of the time I'd be standing over the set, bent over, trying to move everything and hold it, and so it was like, I don't know, uncomfortable yoga for a few weeks. But it was definitely worth it, and it all worked out. I think I could do it again with that space I had. Would I do it again? Is something that I've been pondering. I think because it has been such a big challenge, it's been like so much to learn, which is quite an uncomfortable process. So it has been a really rewarding but also quite a difficult process. And I've loved the outcome. So I don't know at this stage whether I would do another story, but I am pondering it. So there's 2 more Mr. Bear stories in the series. There's Mr. Bear's Best Day and Mr. Bear's Day Out. And it would be really fun. I keep coming back to making the carousel for Mr. Bear's Day Out with the unicorns and the teacups, and I think that would be really fun to see that come to life and actually move. So yeah, never say never. I will definitely ponder that.